Welcome to my session. Thank you so much for coming, and it's a great pleasure for me to speak here in Minneapolis at Twin Cities Camp. And today we will be diving into an amazing adventure of custom imports and how they can be architected in Drupal 8 and what problems and challenges you may be facing with these imports and how to overcome them or how to plan for them. But before we start, let me take a moment and introduce myself. So my name is Anna Mykhailova. I'm originally from Ukraine, and it's a small country in Europe. And right now I'm working for Digital Echidna, a Canadian company in London, Canada. And we are a full-service Drupal shop. So if you're interested in anything in Drupal, we're always looking for talent, and we're always looking for the opportunities. Without further ado, let's talk about why would you choose a custom import. As all of you know, we have an amazing migrate framework in core right now, and it's experimental in core, but it's moving towards being completely in core, very stable, very nice framework, and I strongly encourage you to familiarize yourself if you're not yet familiar with migrate. However, my session today will be covering an edge cases when migrate doesn't suffice, so you need something a little bit more than migrate. So in scenarios when you have a huge recurring import, let's say thousands of hundreds of records of data that needs to be processed nightly or hourly or even like on shorter intervals, like let's say 30 seconds, 10 seconds, 20 seconds intervals, you might consider to write something custom. And the reason for that would be you need something lightweight and being able to update just the part of the node on entity that you need to without saving the entire entity. Or you need some other operations like let's say unpublishing or deleting or connecting two nodes together, which is not necessarily what migrate does out of the box. As well as let's say you have something complicated data source like maybe you need to combine multiple XML feed files into one, or you need to combine JSON files, CSV files, XML into one before you saving it into Drupal. So all of that would be a good candidate to write in your custom import because you'll have a total control over what it's doing and how precise you can go and how often it should be running. So when you considering that and you answer it yes to any of these questions, then you have to start planning your import. And everything starts with gathering your requirements. And it's very important step that usually gets overlooked by developers. And the reason for that is the scenario can be the client comes to you and they say, hey, we have these programs, we are a big university, we want to import programs, like program details, credentials, course details, and it will be just one content type. Also that seems. Until you start talking and they say, but we also would like a functionality in Drupal to build a view of all programs and be able to sort them or filter them by credits or by a professor or by a full-time or part-time. And then you understand that's not one content type anymore. It could be multiple content types connecting to each other. Let's say professor content type is one content type and then your program is another content type, or taxonomies, or custom fields, or field collections, paragraphs, whatnot. It all gets more complex when you dive into more requirements. So the stress point is here, gather the requirements early on and ask people for user stories, how people would interact with your data that you're importing. Also, talk with your client about is it going to be one-time migration? Because then maybe you should check a migrate module. Or is it going to be periodic? Let's say for higher education clients, we often have a requirement that they update something daily. Let's say if the offering for the program is still open for registration or closed. So that means that you will need a periodic import. Another requirement to consider is, do you want to be putting the responsibility for the import on the client shoulders, or do you want to completely automate it? So let's say, do you provide an interface to run the import manually, or do you have to write something custom that will work on the ground, where it's going to be a cron job, a continuous integration job, or anything like that? And as I said, think about your content type architecture, but also think about your class hierarchy in terms of programming and coding. And before we go in any further, I would like to make a little poll. Who of you has done migrations of any sort? Okay, most of you, great. And who did any sorts of feeds import? All right. Can anybody name like common challenges that you had with feeds module? Anybody?
Memory clustering.
Yes, that's one of them. We ran into memory problems. We ran that a person has to basically sit and watch the batch process all the time until it finishes out. So if you have a large-scale import, this is a requirement that you need to consider before you start building anything. So once you start building, you're considering an options. And one of these options is manual import triggered through the Drupal UI. It will be very similar to feeds. However, if you go in custom, you're controlling exactly what feeds, what basically is processed and at what time, right? Feeds module is still a contrib module, and in Drupal 8 it's not ready yet. So the difference between your custom import and the feeds will be that you will be optimizing the performance and your code and class hierarchy in terms of like processing and loading the server. So there's a concept that we will be covering today will allow you to split the difficult task of bringing a lot of data even through the batch API to Drupal into smaller chunks that do not overload your server. The second option is a cron job. And we know that cron jobs are great for smaller tasks. Usually they also are responsible for something else on your server, and Drupal is basically depends on a lot of cron jobs that are basically clearing your cache, publishing and unpublishing nodes, and doing a lot of other tasks on the side. So you can also separate it in a separate cron tab. However, if it's a lot of data, some hostings provide strict restrictions in terms of the amount of time the cron can run. So on most of the cloud environments it's around 3 minutes. And if that's not enough for your data to be processed and the client needs a very timely import, you cannot guarantee that, let's say, 500,000 of rows of data will be processed during 1 day of cron run. And at this point, you can consider something like continuous integration, which I personally use Jenkins. It's amazing. For me, Jenkins is like cron on steroids because it can do everything cron can do, but you just have complete control over it, and it's outside of your server. It's a good scenario to install it somewhere like on AWS cloud and basically let it trigger your jobs and handle a lot of complicated backend tasks outside of Drupal and not loading your server. So we will cover that a little bit more in detail later on in the presentation. Now, every import starts with the source. And the source can be different. Nowadays, in such different diverse information infrastructure in the internet, you can't really count on one simple source. That's why talk to your client and ask what exactly is going to be a source file, how these source files will be delivered to you, and is there any challenges obtaining these files. The simplest scenario is the IT of the organization can just manually upload it to the folder in Drupal, or automatically dropped to your files folder on Drupal side. That will be the simplest scenario. It's living in Drupal. Drupal absolutely is aware of these files, and nothing bad can possibly happen. So the files can have different formats as well. And simple is JSON or CSV. However, it can be XML with some very difficult schema, or something unknown format, or a legacy format. And you have to figure out how that's going to be parsed before you even start import development. The more complicated scenario if it's an external feed, because you cannot guarantee that this feed source will never fail, right? And that the connection will be established at the point of import. Or if it's something more than external database like MySQL or MS SQL database, then you may need some additional drivers on your server. Or if it's an external server and they drop files to SFTP or FTP that is outside of Drupal install, that can bring challenges as well. Did they provide you with account that is efficient enough to read the files? Do you have root access? Did they test your permissions? All of these questions need to be asked beforehand before you start your development. Once you establish that, think about the architecture. So everything in our world starts with structure, and import is no different. You need to think about your structure and build the content type and test them before you even start writing an import code. And by that I mean, when you build your content type, keep in mind not only fields and final interactions like views, search integrations, any custom functionalities that this content type should present to the end user, but also think about the amount of information that's going to be stored in this content type. For example, if you're a financial company that needs to store prices, daily prices for funds or properties for 10, 12 years, then probably migrating all of this information on a daily basis to the node table is not a good idea. And the reason for that would be that you will have a limited amount of memory on your site with every node request. So when you request in some other content types like basic pages or articles, the search parser will still have to go through the index of all records in the node table in order to find your requested article. And as more records you get in your table, as slow the search will be, as less performance the site will become. So if you're having that problem and you have a lot of data, then maybe it is a better way to build a custom entity. The advantages of custom entity will give you that you don't have to create an entity with thousands of joins, which every field is a join table, right? You will have an ability to create one table for the entity with all the columns being the fields. It's still fieldable through the code. The end user, site builder, editor can still interact it through the Drupal UI, but you have an advantages of performance and of scalability, and it does not affect your normal content type tables like node table. And then also think about the structure of the feed. The simpler the structure is, the better. So if the IT is providing you with a feed that has 20 levels of nesting, this probably may be complicated on parsing and processing the information. So if you can negotiate or explain to the IT what's the preferred format of your feed, or if it can change at all, then may be a good step to start. If it's too complicated to have everything in one file, think about splitting it in multiple files. And think about the format of encoding. Nowadays we have a lot of different encodings. PHP works well only with UTF-8. And sometimes you have feeds that looks like UTF-8, but it's UTF-16 or Unicode or Latin, and you never know which problems you will run into. So there are some tools and libraries for you to help with that. And test your access credentials early. It's this one looks a little bit like simple. Everybody tests access credentials, but at the end of the day, you may spend a lot of time trying to figure out why import that was working on your local install doesn't work on your server, and the simple reason would be just because it can't read the files and no error is generated. So finding the right key is very important. So it's not only the key to the server, but it's a key to parsing. So if you have something like XML, it may end with difficult structure. It might be that XML, simple XML that is coming with PHP is simply not enough. So there are some libraries for your help. I prefer QueryPass. It's a nice library which allows you to parse XML similar to jQuery, where you just basically query selectors and it parses it nicely for you. There is another helpful library that's called encoding. It allows you to convert almost any encoding into UTF-8. Sometimes it still has issues, but most of the time you get pretty good output. Think about your hosting environment. If the client is hosting themselves, that's a good idea to check for the modules that are installed for Apache. Sometimes some servers don't even have curl installed, so if you rely on pulling files with the curl extensions, check for that. And again, special permissions and credentials. Can you write to the server if it's external server? Can you read from it? So the foundation of the import is very simple. It comes to 3 operations. It's how you get the data, parse the data, and save the data. However, there are potential problems. And the biggest one is time of the import. So if the import is very long term, it's easily can basically put down your server and the database just because you will run out of memory. So idea behind the import is to make it as lightweight as possible and break the data in as small digestible chunks so you can process it without actually letting Drupal know that it's doing something massive and that can actually put it down. And another one is the server resources. If you can put import out on multiple servers and process in parallel, and I'll show you the idea behind how you can organize it on the next slide, then it's better. It's performance-wise better. It's better for your end users because they don't notice it. And also think about when it's not your peak of site users. So let's say you're in university in North America, then probably at night time less students going and applying for courses or programs. Then it's good at night time to basically run the import. If you're a hospital and providing something like emergency information, then it might be really difficult to find a window when it's safe to perform an import. So as I said, we have 3 operations. And we will be building the import with approach of 3 queues. So the first queue will be just storing the data sources or links to these data sources that needs to be processed. The second queue is a getter queue that will basically get the data from the sources and store it into Drupal as big blobs of information. And the third queue is a save queue. So it will parse down the data and save it into Drupal. This approach allows you to stop at any point and continue if something bad happens. So let's say you have 5 CSV files that are your source. All you do in the first queue, you just queue them out. The first queue will have all these 5 files for you stored and waiting till the server is ready to make the next step. And the next step, the queue API will grab out the stored data, the link to the file, and then just curl into that and grab the blob of CSV. And it will not do any validation, any processing. It's too expensive. All you do is just check if the data is there. Great. Store it in the save queue. And then the save queue will break it into the getter queue. And then the getter queue will break it down when it's get processing into one line by line records. So let's say you have 500 rows in your blob. You will break it down and store as items in a save queue. So you'll have 500 save queue items. Then when it's time to process the save queue, you will just grab item by item, parse it, and store into the node. What it gives you is that every single node or every single record is always processed in synchronously, right? So it never getting you a broken node. It's always one by one by one. You get the information, you parse the information, you save it. However, it gives you an advantage of parallel processing of multiple records, because all you can do, you can grab 5 items of getter queue and start parsing them and saving them. And then the same with the save queue. So you can create threads without overloading your server. And you can play with it as well. You can say, okay, well, it's taking too much time and memory if I process 5 at once. You can go as low as 1. It depends on really your server resources and your requirements. But it gives you that flexibility. So now let's look at the code. So the trigger of that import can be different. It can be as simple as a custom form with batch API. And who is familiar with batch API in here? Have you done anything with batch API? Yes, a little bit? Okay. So what batch API is, it's basically processes operations that you fit into it in batches. That's why the name. So it basically will do a lot of operations without overloading the server. So you'll have the progress bar, and it will just process the operations that you fit into batch. So the idea behind the manual trigger is only to populate the first queue. So it means that when you have a custom configuration form, you will feed out into the operation to get the source files and save into the first queue, and that's it. The batch will end there, and it will be very fast, because all it does, it just queues down the links to your source files, to the feeds or names of the files, whatever happened to be your source. After that, background process as cron or Jenkins will pick up and just claim item by item and populate your getter queue, and in turn your getter queue will populate your save queue. Or you can start immediately from the background and on cron or on drash command that is called from Jenkins populate the first queue. So the idea is to populate manually the first queue, and from there it will be a chain reaction of one queue populating another queue, populating another queue. So here I have two snippets, which basically usually live separate in separate files. I just merge them for the presentation. On the top example, you see a simple config form base, which is a configuration form with just one button, and all this button does is triggers the batch process and populates the first queue. You can add some configuration options in there, like some clients like to be able to configure if they want to get a queue to be processed immediately, or do they want to do any preprocessors or any other options that might come into the import. Let's say they're importing images, they would like to set their sizes of the images or default alt text. You can all have this as configuration, and then configuration object will be available for you when you processing and parsing your data. And the drash command is just a simple drash command definition. It's nothing different than Drupal 7, and you just do exactly the same. You just grab all the file names or links that you need to process and put them into the queue. After that, I love Drupal 8 because it allows us inheritance and it's completely object-oriented. So I recommend the approach of having a base class and inheriting from that. And in this example, all it allows you to do is to have two processors. One processor is a cron job. So let's say your client wants background and manual. You will be able to trigger either one of them, and you don't have to write any custom code. Those two classes at the bottom, so basically this is all it will be in this class, because they will be inheriting from the base class. And in the base class, this is where your business logic is going. In there, you will basically parse the data blob that you just got into the queue, and populate your setter queue, your saving queue in here. And you don't save it to Drupal, you just basically split the blob into multiple rows and save, and waiting for the Drupal to have enough time to process your setter queue. And the idea to take from these snippets is the difference between these two plugins of child classes is just annotation, plugin annotation. And the only difference is cron time. As soon as you set up a plugin as a cron time, it will run on cron. If you omit this, it will be triggered manually whenever you call it in code. Then you have your setter queue. This is where you save in everything Drupal, line by line, so you don't overload the server. And the good part about it, if it stops on a one queue item, it will pick up when it's called again from this item, so you will not lose your information. And exactly the same, you're basically inheriting from the base class to your child classes. And that's it. This is all you need to do for the import. You queue the items that you need to get the information from. You queue the blobs of information from these items. You parse them and you queue line by line your data source, and you save it into Drupal. 3 simple steps allow you to save a lot of performance, allow you to be fast and efficient, and decide when and how you're going to process it. And that's practically the end of this presentation. Any questions? Yeah?
Is it possible to roll back here?
If you write a rollback, then yes. But you have, because it's completely custom, you have to define the rollback function. So you have to define the rule how you find the ones that you want to delete and delete them. But yes, I was writing completely crude interface, so create, update, and delete. There's no problems. Any other questions? Yeah?
Will you share the slides?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I will upload the slides. Yeah?
How do you prevent kind of like log jams in that save queue? So like if you do encounter like a line record and like one record has a problem, but it just stops all further processing, how do you kind of skip over that one to get the other?
Well, basically, if your queue item fails, the queue API in Drupal will handle it for you, right? It will mark it as a failed item. You can provide a log or something for yourself, and it will just skip to another one. It doesn't really block the operation. It's like what Drupal queue API does by default. If it can't process it, it will mark it to return later to try again. And if it can't, then it will just, okay, I will delete this. And no? No? Well, I hope it was useful. I know it's a lot to grasp, but thanks for coming. And if you want, you can grab a little Drupal buddies in here.